Reprise du débat, l'honorable député de Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands et Rideau Lakes.
Well, here we go again. Another case of this NDP-Liberal government who, after 9 years, is finding themselves in a situation where, and I don't know, Speaker, I don't know if I hear the sound of a pager beeping back there, but maybe that member can quiet it.
The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, that is a disgusting comment, and he should be asked to retract that. That is clearly referring to pagers that has been used as weapons that have taken the lives of innocent people, including children. I asked this member, he should be apologizing for that, but he should also be apologizing for the slander he used in this chamber yesterday.
I was hearing a lot of debate going on there while the honourable member did have the floor. I would maybe let the honourable member maybe retract that last comment before he continues. The honourable member Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
Withdrawn. Speaker, here we have the NDP desperate to cover up for these Liberals that they've been propping up all the while their friends have been lining their pockets. The NDP, like that member from Edmonton who can't manage to keep her voice down, have done nothing to raise their voice for Canadians who are suffering after 9 years of their support for this government that's seen corruption time after time. And that member for Edmonton has done nothing to advocate for the millions of Canadians who are now using food bank. A third of them are children. We hear the NDP are supposed to fight for the downtrodden and those that need a hand up, but we've seen them turn their backs on workers, turn their backs on Canadians, turn their backs on the hungry. And that member for Edmonton has led the charge to prop up this government that's done absolutely has the worst record on standing up for vulnerable Canadians. And it's absolutely shameful. This is a great example today that we find ourselves in this House talking about as a result of that member's support for this government, and they're allowing for hundreds of millions of dollars to line the pockets of insiders. And what does the government do as soon as they're ordered by the House to produce documents? Well, of course, we find ourselves with this government turning their back on their obligation to the sacred institution of Parliament. They're refusing an order to produce the documents. Why? Well, of course, they got caught. They got caught stacking a board with their friends, like the chair of the SDTC board, friend of the Prime Minister's, Annette Verscherian. And what did their friend do when she got put into this place of trust, a place of privilege? Well, she lined her pockets and lined the pockets of her friends. And we see that there was a finding of guilt by the Ethics Commissioner. Now, it's like Groundhog Day every time you talk about scandals and corruption with these Liberals. That Liberal Prime Minister, the first in Canadian history to be found to have broken Canada's ethics laws, twice he was found guilty of breaking the law. It's unbelievable. But that's the state. That's the state of that NDP Liberal government. And it's said that a fish rots from the head down, and that's what we've seen with multiple ministers in that NDP Liberal government found to have broken the law. And, you know, when it comes to the office of the Ethics Commissioner, we have the Prime Minister's buddy, now the Public Safety Minister, who himself had been found to have broken the law. When given the chance, when the Ethics Commissioner's office was vacated, what did they do? They appointed his sister-in-law to take over the Ethics Commissioner's office. Unbelievable. Every time they get the chance to do the right thing, you can set your watch to it. They do the absolute opposite. They do the opposite every single time. And it's the International Development Minister, who's the failed housing minister, the trade minister, their former finance minister. The conflicts of interest go on and on and on with them. And their solution to the economic vandalism that they've perpetrated on this country after 9 years is they find a buddy of the Prime Minister's, not a buddy like David Johnston of the Trudeau Foundation, who was the Prime Minister's neighbor and ski buddy, who they wanted to use his reputation to whitewash their failures to call out, detect, and disrupt foreign interference in our democracy like they did with David Johnston. Not that kind of friend. A friend like Mark Carbon Tax Carney. And the conflicts of interest, you could call him conflict of interest Carney, but it's almost synonymous with everyone who associates themselves with these Liberals. The conflicts of interest just follow. Yep. It was within days, just days, of them naming Mark Carbon Tax Carney as the de facto finance minister, after the Prime Minister's office had taken the named finance minister and deputy prime minister and started strategic leaks about how they'd lost confidence in her. But instead of firing her, they just appointed some man that's a friend of the Prime Minister's, who shares his ideological bent to tax Canadians just for the crime of trying to feed themselves and heat themselves and to put gas in their cars to get to medical appointments and to their jobs. So Mark Carbon Tax Carney has a buddy who is the head of a company called Telesat. So within days of him being named as the new financial advisor, economic advisor to the Prime Minister, his buddy at Telesat gets $2.14 billion of tax dollars. And you'd say, well, that's a scandal. That's enough of a scandal to put an end to this latest conflicted appointment. And you'd wonder why the economic interest, why the conflicts of interest of Carney aren't under the purview of the same rules that designated public office holders have. Well, they're paying him through the Liberal Party to avoid the necessary disclosure that would have also revealed to Canadians that his company, that he's the chair of, Brookfield Global Asset Management, is going to benefit substantially from changes to the mortgage rules that this government made a day after the last announcement they made that was conflicted on Telesat. So they're going to further put more burden on Canadians, and their changes to mortgage insurance. And the reason they're doing this, when they have a terrible supply problem in the housing market, they didn't announce some program to solve supply. No government has ever spent so much to achieve so little as they have on housing. What did they do? They decided to increase demand. Why on earth would they take measures to increase demand in housing during a housing supply crisis? Well, of course, the Prime Minister's new economic advisor, Mark Carbon Tax Carney, his company stands to benefit financially from it. This is just within days of his being appointed. So we have to wonder, why wouldn't they bring him under the auspices, under the umbrella of the conflict of interest regime? Well, because everyone they bring under it gets found guilty of breaking it. And when items come to this House, when we look to have audits in situations like the $60 million Arrive scam, let's canvass the government benches on how they vote on having the Auditor General investigate their scandal to support Liberal insiders grift to the tune of millions of dollars from Canadians. I'm not hearing the heckles now from them about how they all voted in favor of that audit, because they didn't. They voted against having the Auditor General investigate. For shame. What did we find out? Well, of course, there was no value for money. They wasted taxpayer dollars on an app that ultimately didn't work, wrongly forced 10,000 people under house arrest for weeks. And then we saw their buddies, the two yo-yos operating out of a basement from GC Strategies. These guys adding no value for Canadians. But are you going to defend the yo-yos?
A point of order from the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, what we're witnessing is a litany of character assassinations on all different types of fronts. My question, the issue is that the member is not necessarily being relevant to the production of papers. That's what we're supposed to be debating, not character assassination of everyone that comes to his mind that happens not to be a Conservative.
Thank the honourable member for his input. I would also maybe caution the honourable member to stay as relevant as possible. The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Free Lakes.
Yeah, they'd have to have character for it to be assassinated. Speaker, what we're talking about, and we see from the parliamentary secretary always the full court press to try and deflect from the failures of his government to exercise their fiduciary responsibility to Canadians. An absolute failure in that responsibility. And what's the connection? What's the connection between their billion-dollar green slush fund that they allowed hundreds of millions of dollars to go out the door illegally in contravention of the contribution agreement, and the $60 million Arrive scam, or his Prime Minister being found to have broken the law, or the front bench ministers over there being found to have broken the law? What's the connection? What's the connection to the WE scandal? What's the connection to conflict of interest Carney or Mark Carbon Tax Carney? What's the connection to the unwillingness of this government to recognize the will of Canadians? What's the connection? Of course the connection is that every time these Liberals are given the chance to do the right thing, they do the wrong thing. And that couldn't be more evident than it is with the motion that we're dealing with. Now, my honourable colleague from Mégantic-Lorab moved an amendment to the motion that they take great umbrage with. And it's very telling. They're telling on themselves when they don't support it. What's the partisan attack, the character assassination they're worried about? Let's read how mean-spirited the amendment is. That the following witnesses be ordered to appear before the committee separately for 2 hours each. And then it lists a series of government ministers. They don't want the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry. They don't want the Clerk of the Privy Council, the Auditor General, the Commissioner of the RCMP, Deputy Minister, Innovation, Science and Economic Development, the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel of the House of Commons, the Acting President of Sustainable Development Technology Canada, and a panel consisting of the Board of Sustainable Development Technology Canada. Why don't they want them to come and testify? Are they afraid of what they're going to say? They're going to learn from the Parliamentary Law Clerk that Parliament absolutely has the unfettered authority to order exactly what it did in the production of these documents to be transmitted to the RCMP. That's what they're going to find out from the Parliamentary Law Clerk. But they're terrified of it. Are they going to find out from ISED that their minister and their officials, that they didn't actually take action on the corruption at Sustainable Development Technologies Canada, the billion-dollar green slush fund, until after Conservatives initiated a full court press against them? That's what you're going to hear. You're going to hear recordings of one of their officials describing it as, quote, sponsorship level of corruption. Well, that brought down a Liberal government, so maybe that's what they're worried about. The corruption and scandals that have been identified by departmental officials in their own government. Corruption. That's the theme. That's the theme. And when the member for Windsor is looking for a new job, he can actually read the AG's report and see what they found out. They found out that they allowed it to happen. And you think about the hundreds of millions of dollars that they said were for one thing but were really for another, which is like the case with so many things with this government. Like with their carbon tax, that doesn't reduce emissions but does increase poverty. That doesn't help our environment, but does lengthen the lines at our food banks. Their use having doubled after 9 years of this NDP-Liberal government. That's the legacy of that member for Windsor. That's the legacy for the member for Windsor, is record lines at food banks. It's Canadians not being able to afford their mortgages, not being able to afford their rent, not being able to afford to put gas in their car. Food banks having to extend their hours so that people who have 2 jobs can come in between their 2 jobs to pick up food at the food bank. That's his legacy. And it's just shameful. It's shameful that when they have the opportunity to save $1 by not letting it go into the pockets of insiders, that they're too beholden to a Prime Minister twice found guilty of breaking the law himself to actually stand up and say, you know what, we need to do the right thing, and these documents need to be transmitted and sent to the RCMP. Now, the RCMP has the option to investigate or not. That's their independent right. But why are they so afraid to send the documents? Because what we know, the reason we know so much is because of whistleblowers. Whistleblowers came forward and exposed the corruption under these Liberals. And they've been desperate to try and stop it from coming to light. It's not enough to have the Auditor General issue a damning report. It's not enough to have the Ethics Commissioner find their hand-picked Liberal chair in a conflict of interest. That's not enough for them. Why? Because it always comes down to helping Liberal insiders with these guys. It's incredible the lengths that they will go to protect those who need it the least instead of those who need it the most. And that's Canadians. Canadians after 9 years of the most unethical government in Canadian history. And so I know that over the summer, any of them who were brave enough to knock on doors, and I'm sure that guy wasn't, that they would have heard the same thing we heard, that Canadians are exhausted. Canadians are exhausted, and they see this government for exactly for what it is. And it's tired, it's costly, it's one that's raised their taxes, it's one that's seen crime run rampant, put the rights of convicted criminals ahead of those of bona fide victims, who spend more targeting those who follow the law to the tunes of tens of millions of dollars, while spending little on those who seek to smuggle, engage in human trafficking and weapons trafficking and drug trafficking. That's the legacy. That's their legacy after 9 years. But there is good news, of course, and that's that common sense Conservatives have been doing their homework on these Liberals and the institutions that they've corrupted, like the Sustainable Development Technologies Canada. And look, you'll hear they'll say, well, wasn't SDTC started by Conservatives? Yep, it was. And in 2017, it was received an audit by the Auditor General and got a clean bill of health. Wow. But what happened between 2017 and 2023? Well, the Liberal Prime Minister and his accomplice, the leader of the NDP, allowed for Liberal insiders to ransack the place, to push their objective, the organizational objective aside, and allow the well-connected Liberal insiders to get ahead. And that's not something that we're going to abide. That's why we dug in. And you look at the work that members have done to bring this to the House, and then the House voted, these Liberals are so illiberal. And undemocratic. You have the majority, you have the House of Commons vote, order something to happen, and they say, well, we don't actually need to do that thing. What does that tell you about their respect for the rule of law, their respect for Canadians, their respect for the the democracy that each of us have been elected into to represent Canadians here in this place. But they certainly don't think much. They certainly don't think much about it, and they don't think much about the effect it's going to have on Canadians, unless those Canadians, of course, are their well-connected friends. But the motion, the amendment that have been put forward are, of course, incredibly reasonable, as was the original production order, because it falls entirely inside the bounds of what this House is allowed and must do to ensure Canadians' confidence in our democratic institutions. And so the NDP and the Liberals can flail and wail all that they like, but common sense Conservatives are going to continue to demand accountability and answers for Canadians. When we talk about stopping the crime, we're talking about stopping these guys, because life wasn't like this before these NDP Liberals, and it's not going to be like it after them. Thank you very much.
Questions?